right. Well, I'm really glad all of you came tonight. We're going to talk about clustering tools. What are clustering tools? How can you use them in your genealogy research? One of the things that I would also mention is that tonight we're talking about MyHeritage in particular, but there are other clustering tools that you can use. And at the end, we'll talk about one that exists for Ancestry that you can use, the Jonathan Brecker tool. And I'll mention that again, and you can write down the name of it. Also, and I've got a demo of that. Also, there's clustering tool at GEDmatch. So we'll talk about that. I'm not going to show the clustering tool at GEDmatch because I don't currently have an account there. I kind of disabled my account last fall when they were sold to Verigen, but I have used their clustering tool in the past. And all of them function about the same way. So I think looking at the one at MyHeritage, it's going to be similar to anything else you're going to find. There's another popular clustering tool called Genetic Affairs. And although I've not used that, I have looked at that before, and it is very, very similar to MyHeritage. So once you understand kind of the concept behind clustering, I think you'll understand that you could come at this from many different directions. And just like anything else, your preference of tool might be different than someone else's. So I'm just going to feature this one, talk about the others, and then we'll do some demos after we stop the recording. So let me talk first about, you can do this. Clustering is not a difficult thing to do. However, it can be a little bit challenging to understand in the beginning what you're looking at. But once you understand that, it's actually quite an amazing tool that you can use to piece together or cluster together groups of people who are your matches, who also go back to assuming the same ancestral couple. Now we'll talk about that in a minute because you can't always assume it's the same ancestral couple because of endogamy. But in general, if you don't have endogamy in your family, you can tie a clustered group back. I am going to apologize because the backgrounds are very faint and kind of sometimes hard to see. And part of that is because MyHeritage uses a lot of light color. And so it's a little bit frustrating sometimes to do the screenshot. So I'm just going to apologize for that ahead of time. Hopefully we can kind of gut it out. So let's talk about what it looks like first and then talk about what it is in more detail. So I could go into a whole big explanation, but until you've seen the visual, I think sometimes it's a challenge to wrap your head around what it is. So let's talk about the topics for today. How can I use clustering to break down brick walls? That's one thing we're going to talk about. How can I make some screenshots to tell my story, to kind of collect up my evidence, to build my research report, whatever it is that you'd like to do with that. And then how can you get organized? Now tonight, we're not going to talk about how to get organized. I'm just giving you a little preview of what we're going to do next time, because we are going to talk about how on earth do we keep track of all these things. We've got PDFs and spreadsheets, we've got screenshots, we've got paper, you know, how do we get all that together so that we can start to make some really valid conclusions and progress. So this is what the clustering tool looks like. And this one is my dad's. So let's look at this for a minute. So again, I apologize that it's kind of so whitewashed out, but it's the way it looks on screen. I tried to invert the colors because sometimes you can do that on a browser. You can invert colors and it made it almost unreadable. So I figured this is going to be the best shot we have. So this is what my dad's cluster looks like. And like most things that I talk about, I have permission from my family members, my close family members to share, but you'll notice that along the top and along the left side, I've kind of whited out, erased out some of the names. So you'll see that these are all people that I've obviously not asked permission from. So I just kind of went across and used mostly first names over there. So let's look at this and talk about what do these clusters mean. So the tool at MyHeritage, Genetic Affairs, or any of the tools that any of the places you're going to go to cluster, takes your match list and all of the people that you match. So at GEDmatch, that's the one-to-many list. At MyHeritage, it's your match list. At Jonathan Brechter's tool, you can import your match list from Ancestry. So it takes those matches, and what it does is it groups them together by all the people who have something in common. So that first box, that red box, is 9 members. Cluster number 1 has 9 members. And those 9 people have DNA in common with my dad, because this is his cluster. So my dad, those 9 people have DNA in common with my dad, and some of them have DNA in common with each other, and some of them do not. And we're going to talk about what that looks like. We're going to talk about what the random gray squares look like that are kind of speckled throughout there. So we're going to talk about all these different pieces so that you can have a little bit better understanding of how to use this. So let's look at Dad's cluster number 1. So the first cluster that he had, and again, I've redacted all the last names, but the first cluster that he had has some dark red. And the dark red is where my dad matches, or I'm sorry, where my dad matches each person, but they match themselves. So can you see here, Cheryl J matches herself. Think of it like a times table. Derek N matches himself in this darker red box. Brandon N matches himself in this darker red box. So the diagonal is each person matching themselves. They also match my dad. So my dad matches all 9 of these people. The reason why they're clustered together is because some of them match each other. So the light red is where people match my dad and match each other. So let's look at Derek and Brandon. Derek and Brandon match my dad and also match Cheryl. Derek and Brandon match, let's go over here, my dad, and both match Vanessa. Derek and Brandon both match my dad and Emily B. So do you see how that lighter color indicates that they not only match my dad, they match each other. But what we also know is that in the white, they match my dad, but not each other. So Cheryl J matches my dad, but not Vanessa. And Cheryl J matches my dad and not Emily. So remember, in DNA analysis, it's every bit as important who doesn't match as who does match. Those are both valuable things to know. So we've got 3 different kinds of coloration. Dark color is where someone matches themselves. Light color is where someone matches my dad or you or whoever you're looking at in the clustering, my dad and each other. That would be light red. And then they don't match each other. They match my dad, but don't match each other. That would be white. So there are 3 variations. Some of the tools have slightly different coloration, but they're all generally like that. So these matches are all related to my dad. All of these matches match themselves. So Cheryl matches Cheryl, Derek matches Derek, Brandon matches Brandon. Some of these matches are related to my dad and each other, and they are light red. And others of these matches are related to my dad, but not each other. They're white. So that's the main color concept that goes with clustering. So what does this mean in terms of clustering? Well, it means that this group can lead you back to an ancestral couple. Now, there might be more people in this group over time as more people test. It's entirely possible that the next time you do the clustering, there will be more people who join in the cluster. Can everybody mute, please? Maybe I can mute you. I think I can mute people, so, okay. There might be more people who come into these groups with time. And what you'll see with the MyHeritage charts is that it will give you a look in time, but you can run the tool again and collect up all your matches again and potentially have more people added to the groups. Also, your siblings could have more people who match to this same cluster, and we'll talk more about that a little towards the end. So your siblings match more people or fewer people depending on the DNA that's passed down. You might match people that your brother or your sister doesn't match, and vice versa. So siblings sometimes can give you an even larger subset of people in the cluster to look at. And we're actually going to do a couple screenshots of that so you can see what that looks like. Because I do actually have clustering for my brother and my sister. So I know this is kind of hard to read, but I want you to see what the full thing looks like. And when you're looking at it at home, you can upsize your screen. You might be able to, on the recording, you know, make it a little bit larger. But this is still my dad's cluster. And there are 9 members who match dad and match each other. Some match each other and some don't. And that's cluster number 1. And the color coding key is over here on the right-hand side. And some people have a lot of clusters, maybe up into the 20s, and other people just have a few. So I'll show you a couple demos about that. But this first group has 9 people in it in cluster number 1. Remember that diagonal line? That's where each person matches themselves. In the next cluster, I've kind of zoomed in a little bit. There are 5 people in the next cluster, and those 5 people are orange in this case. They're orange. The color coding actually is not something that makes a difference. Cluster number 1 can be red, cluster number 2 can be orange. The colors don't really matter. The fact that they're grouped together is what's important. So this cluster has 5 members in it, and our assumption is that that red group links back to an ancestral couple. The orange group leads back to an ancestral couple where my dad and these 5 people all go back to the same ancestor. So it's a nice automated shortcut, shall we say, for triangulation and some of the things we used to have to do very longhand, shall we say. I used to spend a lot of time building these kind of groups just from the match lists and just from the shared matches and the in common with. So that's something that over time, I'm so thankful for this tool because this greatly speeds me up. And the fact that I have this for my brother and my sister, or my father, or my mother, or my children is really helpful in sorting matches. The next cluster is yellow, and there are 5 members in that cluster. And the last cluster is green. And each cluster represents a group of people likely linked to another ancestral couple. Now you might be saying, how do I know which ancestral couple? Well, that's where you have to do triangulation and look at trees. And so we'll talk a little bit about how to do that. Each cluster can lead you to an ancestral couple. So members of the cluster match you, and some or all of the other members. The cluster could be your 3rd great-grandparents and someone else's 3rd great-grandparents, and maybe that's where the common link is. But also it could be your 3rd great-grandparents and someone else's 2nd great-grandparents. Or it could be your 3rd great-grandparents and somebody else's 4th great-grandparents. So the generational thing sometimes is a challenge to figure out. It's helpful though, because most of the sites like MyHeritage will tell you approximate age of your match. So I know that if I'm looking at my 3rd great-grandparents and I'm matching someone 20 or 30 years older than I am, or 20 or 30 years younger than I am, I have a gauge then for which set of great-grandparents they might match. So what are those gray squares? Because we didn't really talk about that, but sometimes there are gray squares, and I'm going to go back so we can look at where the gray is. Do you see where some of these little gray squares are? These are people who can't quite be placed in a cluster. However, it's possible that they're part of one or both of the ones nearby. So the gray ones we don't normally focus on too much, but if you open your clustering tool and you find that your results have a lot of gray, then you probably are thinking endogamy or pedigree collapse, because that's a good way to see visually that you have people outside of one cluster or another, but might be related to both. So they might be worth investigating, but when you're first starting this, start with the major blocks and then work your way down. Don't forget about the scientific method. Anytime you do anything with DNA analysis, confirmation bias can happen. You think you know the right answer. You think that you know what it is that the right answer is. It's really an easy thing to do to have confirmation bias. For me, that happens in clustering a lot with names. When I see that a number of different people have the same name, or go back to the same name on my tree, that's a hint, but sometimes I do find myself thinking, oh, that must be the connection. And so we have to guard ourselves against just the assumptions that we make. Remember, your hypothesis is not a conclusion, it's a guess, so you need to continue to work on building trees and figuring it out. Ruling things out, the negative is just as important as ruling things in, the positive. So again, those colored squares versus white squares versus gray squares, all of those things have meaning and all of them are important. And science doesn't only accept evidence that supports your predetermined conclusion. So you have to be really careful about that. A lot of us think that our tree is right, there's no way it could be wrong. You know, there are a lot of things like that that come into play. Where we rule things out that we really shouldn't rule out. And just remember, a common name in a family does not always mean that that's where the DNA came from. So it's a good place to start. So I'll show you tonight where I had a match to someone with the surname Robbins, and that's one of the surnames in my family. And so it's a natural assumption for me to think, if I have Robbins in my family, my grandmother was a Robbins, and if they have Robbins in their family, then maybe we're related through the Robbins. That's a great hypothesis. That is not the best conclusion. So it still needs to be proven, but take those leads where you can, because that'll speed you up a little bit. In addition to the clusters, you have more information. So I'm going to show you this, and of course we'll demo this in a little bit, but I have a couple screenshots. If you scroll down past the clusters in MyHeritage, what you will find is that there's also information there. So let's look at this chart for a minute. This is the cluster 1 for my dad. And again, I've redacted the last names, but your list will show you whatever their username is or their upload name. It gives you this blue hot link so you can get back to Cheryl or Derek or Brandon's results. You can see how they match dad and see what the relationship is and that sort of thing. It also shows you the minimum centimorgans with the centimorgans that you have in common, the largest centimorgan segment, how many segments there are, in common with. So Cheryl has in common with my dad six other matches. And it tells you which cluster they're in. So if you scroll down the table, it'll tell you cluster 1, all those 9 people. Then it'll have the 5 people from cluster 2, the 5 people from cluster 3, and so on. And then the number under the tree column tells you how many people they have in their family tree. And so the wonderful thing is that people are starting to upload family trees, or at least direct descendants. direct ancestors, sorry, to their trees, and that's really helpful for you to see, and I'll show you some of those in a minute. So remember, the trees are hot linked and the names are hot linked, or the usernames. And so the username will take you back to that match with dad, and the tree hot link will take you to their tree. And there's a number of different ways to view the trees. And so we'll demo a couple of those as well. So remember, to be successful, organize, analyze, look for patterns. I talk about that in almost every DNA talk that I do, because part of the problem is we get so excited, we go down the rabbit hole, we forget where we were, we didn't do screenshots, we can't find where we were. So we're going to talk a little bit about how to do some screenshots and organize, and then our next month we'll do our talk on how to really get organized, maybe with a research report or folders on your computer and that sort of thing. So let's think about which cousins fill the gap. So just a reminder, your first cousins, you have common grandparents. Your second cousins, you have common great-grandparents. Your third cousins, you have common great-great-grandparents, and so on. So that, and also I will say that the default settings for MyHeritage, Ancestry, 23andMe, they all have default settings that represent lots of relationships. But in general, when we're talking about clustering, we're looking at third or fourth or fifth cousins. And so that gives you an idea. Your third cousin matched with someone, you're looking somewhere in the great-great-grandparent range for you, and maybe in the second or third great-grandparent range for someone else. So that's where we're going to use that information, and I'll show you how I kind of keep track of that. The more remote the cousin is, the further back the connection is. But remember, there's kind of a law of diminishing returns, because small segments are troublesome. So anything smaller than 7 can be problematic, and you probably are not going to be able to tie back directly to an ancestor. Now, there are people who have differing views on that. Blaine Bettinger does a number of talks about small segments. He writes about it in his book. But it is something that you should consider. Sometimes the very small segments are just passed down generation after generation. They survive recombination, they survive meiosis, and you end up having small segments that can be very old and not necessarily tied back to a specific person. We'll do a talk one of these days on small segments, because it is perilous to be using small segments. So remember, the tools tell you the default category of the relationship. So a first cousin in most of the tools is about a 12.5% match, but it could be another relationship. Doesn't necessarily mean that person is your first cousin. So how much DNA is shared with cousins? The reason why I included this is because this might be something you want to print and have with you when you're looking at all these different matches and tools. This is from the Shared Centimorgan project, which is Blaine Bettinger's project. The link is down there for DNApainter.com, and DNA Painter has the Shared Centimorgan tool live on there, where you can input either the percentage of DNA in common or the average number of centimorgans, or however many centimorgans your match has, and you can highlight the relationships that you should be looking at. What I've included here are the common ones you're going to be dealing with when it comes to clustering. Primarily, you're dealing with third, fourth, and fifth cousins. So to match both of your parents, 100% of your DNA is around 7,000 centimorgans. To match one parent is roughly 3,500 centimorgans, depending on the tool, depending on whether it's Ancestry, MyHeritage, GEDmatch. They all vary slightly, but they're close to that. So you share 50% on average in common with each parent. So you are 12.5% with your first cousin. So the Shared Centimorgan project has an average of 866 centimorgans in common. Second cousins is 229, third cousins 73, fourth cousins 35, fifth cousins 25. So that's where the average centimorgans come from, and that's from the Shared Centimorgan Project. So you can look at that link if you haven't already seen that. It's a fantastic tool. And it's on DNApainter.com, but you do not have to sign up or be a member or pay a fee to use that tool in DNA Painter. It's free. Everybody loves free. All right. One thing I do want to mention before, two other things while we're looking at this chart. For third cousins, you share approximately 1% of your DNA with your third cousins, but you can share none of your DNA with your third, fourth, or fifth cousins. That's why your siblings can be really important to fill the gaps, because your siblings could share DNA with a third or fourth or fifth cousin that you don't. So it is entirely possible that you don't share a match with a third or fourth or fifth cousin, and they still are your third, fourth, or fifth cousin. Remember also this last column, I always include this just as a reminder, there's a large percent of DNA that we don't inherit with these relationships. So if I have a third cousin that I match at 1%, or 73 centimorgans approximately, I also have 99% of my DNA that I don't match them. So I think it's also important to remember that I'm matching them at that 1%, but there's 99% that I don't match them. So sometimes it's important to remember that. So let's look at the dad's first match in cluster number 1. So you can see how you can use the tool and figure out which family this is and which ancestral couple. So the first match that my dad had was someone named Cheryl. So when I clicked on Cheryl's name, what came up here, I've redacted her face, but what came up here is that my dad is in his 80s, actually turned 80 last week, and Cheryl is in her 50s. She's from the US. That may be an important clue if your DNA match is from the US or not. If you're not familiar with MyHeritage, they test a lot in Europe, Australia, the Middle East, Israel, Italy, many, many different European countries. So you're going to see a lot of matches that are from other parts of the world and people who aren't necessarily in the US databases. So I've tested at MyHeritage for a couple of reasons. The first one is I tested my husband there because he's German, and most of his really high matches are actually still in Germany, and they were tested through MyHeritage. The reason why I tested through MyHeritage is because I do a lot of teaching with all these different tools, and I wanted to learn more about it, but I found lots of matches from all over the world to my German ancestors, my Dutch ancestors, and even some of my UK. So I've been really pleased at what I've found there. Cheryl's relationship to my dad is third to fifth cousin, and you can see the DNA match is 0.6%, about 40 centimorgans over 2 segments, but the largest one is almost 33 centimorgans. That's pretty good. If you have a match where your largest segment is 7, move on. So don't try to figure too much into the 7s unless you've got a large cluster and you can tie some people together. But 32 is a good chunk. So if you look here under the ancestral surnames, you can see on the left what I've uploaded from my dad and my family tree. So he has a great-great-grandmother who is a Clark. And also there's another generation back further, I think her father was John Clark. So a third great-grandfather, John Clark. And then my father's match, Cheryl, has someone in her tree that is a Clark. So automatically, what's our assumption? Well, we could be related through the Clarks. But what should be our hypothesis? Let's check that out. Not necessarily our conclusion. We can't conclude that we're related through the Clarks, but that's a pretty good guess. Now, she's only the first person in that cluster. Remember, there were 9 people. So we're going to want to look for patterns of who's related. to different surnames and how are they related to one another. So this is just the beginning. So I looked at her tree. There's a place up here, I don't know if you can see this. I've got my mouse over it. It says view tree right under her picture. So you can view the tree. And what I did, I blew it out to 10 generations and I did a screenshot of it, and I'll show you this during the demo part. But from the user, the test taker is all the way on the left, private, the left part of the blue. And then there's parents, grandparents, great-grandparents, and it works its way out. So the Clark for this particular match, Cheryl, is right here, Cynthia Clark. And she doesn't know beyond that who Cynthia Clark's parents are. So this is still some great information because you can think about what generation is this. So this is the person, the parents, grand, great, second grade, third grade, fourth grade. So fourth grade is where the Clark shows up. Fifth grade would be where potentially the ancestral couple is, or maybe even a generation back from that. So that's my first lead. Now that doesn't mean that I'm only going to investigate the Clarks, but that's the only name in common. What I might look for too is locations in common, timelines where people are in the same proximity, and those other genealogy things that we do. But for clustering, my first thought is let's see what all of these folks have in common. Then I'm going to look at my tree. So here's my tree with my dad. And first cousins share grandparents. So I've got here in blue my dad's grandparents. And this is from Family Tree Maker software. Then I also have second cousins who share great-grandparents with my dad. Third cousins to my dad would share great-great-grandparents to my dad. So this is where knowing what kind of cousin match it is might give you an idea of what generation that match is. Now, I don't know if you've spotted the Clark yet. Let me give you a minute to look here. Do you see where the Clark shows up in my dad's? All the way down here in the lower right corner, Florence Clark. That's the Clark in my dad's tree, and if I expand that, Family Tree Maker lets you click on that little arrow and keep expanding it. So if I expand Florence Clark, I get John Clark, and Francis Fitzgerald is who he married. Have you seen John Clark before? That was on my dad's tree, right? Florence Clark and John Clark. And then there was another Clark that was on his matches tree. So maybe there are children of John Clark, other daughters. Maybe there's another couple further back that had a daughter who matches the other match. So this is going to be my first lead, and likely the ancestral couple is going to be right in this range. My dad's fourth great grandparents. So let's look at a couple other clusters. My dad has cluster number 10 and number 11. These are a little bit interesting. If you look at number 11, everybody here is related to each other. Can you see that? There's no white squares. The other thing of interest is there are these two gray, light gray right here. They probably belong in this cluster. And so we should look at those as well. We're not going to have time to look at all of those, but I just want to show you some of the techniques you can use. So for cluster 10, there are 4 people. And again, you'll get their full names here. I've redacted the last names. For cluster number 11, there are 4 people. Look at this tree situation over here. 179, that's pretty good. 9, 90. So there's some high numbers here for the trees. So that's some good information. And of course, we always have to remember other people's trees, right? Also notice that these matches have other matches they have in common. So this is a really tight group, this cluster number 11. because they're all related in some way to one another. That's a really important thing, a really tight group. So we're going to look at a couple of these. I think I started with Ferguson. So let's look at cluster number 10, a match named Ferguson. And it doesn't say Ferguson first name or last name, so I have no idea what that is. That was just the username. So I look at the tree for Ferguson, maybe private first name, last name Ferguson. And what I find is, if you go far enough out, I've got here a Murdo McDonald and Effie McDonald. And in my family tree, I'll show you that, I have McDonald's here. And remember, the spelling is, you know, never know, but she was from Scotland, and so was James Calderwood, and they came to the United States. And so the McDonald here could be related to the McDonald in this other tree for Ferguson. Not necessarily, but it's a good start. So maybe our link is this father and mother of Catherine McDonald. So let's go back and look at Ferguson's tree again. Ferguson has an Effie McDonald, born in 1810. So let's look at my tree. 1810, maybe a little bit old to be a sister of Catherine, maybe not. They had children a very, very long time. So some clusters look different than others. Let's talk about what they can look like, because sometimes you'll see weird things. And so I want you to kind of have an idea of what some of those might be. This is my husband's clustered matches. And can you see here that there's two noticeable things? Give that a look. The first one is that the red block, the first block there, is enormous compared to the others. So why could one block be so much larger than the other? That's a question we might have. The other thing you might notice is, compared to the one we saw earlier with my father, there's a lot more of those odd gray squares. And what did we talk about earlier with those gray squares? Sometimes endogamous or pedigree collapse populations have more of those. So we'll talk about why some of that is important. Let me see if I have, yeah. So for my husband, one side of his family are recent immigrants. His grandfather is the immigrant in the 1900s. And so there are very few US testers in the Bergheimer family. And so one thing that I noticed is that his Irish side, his mom is about 50% Irish and 50% German, and then his dad is pretty much 100% German. Those two mixtures, the Irish Catholic family is showing up in this really large red block. They've been in the United States since the 1860s. They have multiple generations here, multiple children, lots and lots of children, typical Irish Catholic family. So they have a lot more people who have tested and are showing up. Now you might be saying, what about the Germans? You know, this is MyHeritage. There are a lot of Germans who've tested at MyHeritage, and they are showing up in some of the other blocks. But this first block is the Irish Catholic, mostly Americans. For the German side of his family, they have small generations, not small generations, small numbers of children in each generation. So they might have one or two children. I've traced back paperwork being what it is and all the dads being in the right place, probably about 13 generations where there's one or two children. So very, very small numbers of children each time. So that leads me to believe, my guess would be that these are the Irish Catholic, and I've worked on this block a little bit, and they are. they're related to the same set of Irish Catholic ancestors. In fact, many of these other blocks are the Irish Catholic as well. You can use a group of siblings, and that's one way that you can learn more. And if you have one sibling, two siblings, or if you're working on clustering with someone else, someone in your cousin group, and maybe your first cousin has siblings, you can use sibling groups and learn a lot more information. So let me just show you for my sister and myself and my brother. Here are the 3 clusters that we have. And during the demo part, I can open these and show you, but not on the recording. Sorry about that, but during the recording, there's no way for me to redact all the names. So for my sister, her cluster number 1, my cluster number 2 in orange, and my brother's cluster number 1 have duplicate people that lead back to the same ancestral couple. So it doesn't necessarily mean that red, red, and red all lead you back to the same place. You have to look at the matches. So my sister, it has the largest number of matches. You can see over here. I forget how many. I think I counted them, but you can see that first block is a lot larger for my sister, a little bit smaller for my brother, and even smaller for me. But we all have, you see where mine's a lot smaller than my brother's. So we all link back to the same sets of people. So how do you figure out which clusters you have in common with your siblings? Because that's the goal of mine, is looking at all of those matches together, not just looking at mine. If I would just looking at mine, I'd be looking at the smallest set of matches. But my sister and brother actually add a lot of depth to that. So what I did was, for this first cluster, I looked at the spreadsheet. So my heritage clusters come with a spreadsheet of the matches, and it comes with a PDF that explains the specific auto clustering that you're doing. So the PDF for my dad, or the PDF for me, or for my brother, they're all different. They all have specificity in them. So I'll show you those PDFs too once we get finished with this. So this is the spreadsheet data. I pulled the data out because to show the spreadsheet, again, there's no way for me to redact it. But this is my sister's cluster number 1 on the left, my brother's cluster number 1 in the middle, and remember that matched my cluster number 2, which was orange. And so I've just highlighted, I tried to figure out enough ways to highlight so that you could see the difference. But we have 3 matches that all 3 of us have. In yellow, Tinsley. You can see over here, Tinsley, we all 3 have. We also, in pink, all 3 have Betty D. And in, what color? Kind of this weird teal color, dark teal, is Sammy R. We all 3 have matches to Sammy R. So that's where I'm going to start with this cluster to figure out how are we related. So remember, I'm not only looking at how Tinsley, Betty D, and Sammy R are related to me, I'm looking at how they're related to my brother and sister as well. So that's a pretty good solid group of people. And maybe from that, I can figure out the family group that they belong to. Each of us has matches that the others don't. So you can see in white, not highlighted basically, are the ones like I have a match to Anna R, but my siblings do not. I have a match to Jimmy D. My siblings do not. So there are several matches here that are not highlighted, that are individual just to me, just to my brother, or just to my sister. And the reason for that is, remember, 3rd to 5th cousins, you can have no DNA in common with them. They're still related to you. So undoubtedly, all of these people in the list, even Jacob W. in my brother's cluster, is related to me through the same ancestral couple. We just didn't happen to, I didn't happen to get any DNA from him, and neither did my sister get any DNA in common with him. So that's something to keep in mind, is that this whole large group of people all go back to presumably the same couple. My brother and sister have more matches to this ancestral couple than I do. And that's just a function of recombination. That's just the way that DNA was swapped and traded and became egg and sperm. And so it's just the luck of the draw. There'll be some clusters that I have that are larger than ones that they have. I have not yet found where my brother or my sister have an identical cluster to me. There's always, you know, a person or two or five, you know, extra that they have that I don't, or vice versa. So I've not found where we have identical ones. Now, if you have identical twins or identical triplets, they should have identical clusters. If the tool's working right, they should all have identical clusters. But for my identical twins, I only use one of the tests. I uploaded one test to do the clustering because I didn't need to do it for both. So let's look at one of my matches and my sister's matches, Sammy R. So let's go back and look. Sammy R, do you see how we have Sammy R in common? My brother and my sister and I, and that's where I'm going to start. The reason is because the last name Robbins is a family name that I have. It's my grandmother's maiden name. So I'm thinking, let's go to something that I recognize right away. And let's see if all of these people potentially link back to the Robbins or an ancestral couple where Robbins married an Argabrite. And so maybe I can find out some information that way. So what I did was I looked up Sammy R. And he's age 70s. So, you know, my sister's in her low 50s. He's somewhere in his 70s. My brother and sister and I are all in our 50s. So I'm thinking, you know, he's maybe a generation above us, maybe not. He's in Mexico. It's pretty rare on Ancestry's matching that I find a lot of people outside of America, but sometimes. But on MyHeritage, you're going to find people from all around the world. He is registering for my sister as a third to fifth cousin. Again, the same with me, the same with my brother. So third cousin can potentially share second great grandparents. Fourth cousin has shared third great grandparents. Fifth cousin has shared fourth great grandparents. So keep in mind what generation level we're looking at with respect to my sister. So we're looking at her second, third, or fourth great grandparents in that range to try to determine. And then I'm going to look too at the DNA match. So 0.5% shared DNA, there's one segment that's 38. That's a good chunk. Again, 7 or less, leave it alone. For some people, 20 or less, leave it alone. And most of the clustering tools won't even go that low. I'll show you where you can find that information too on the PDFs that they send. So this is the chunk of the family tree that I was interested in, starting with Robbins and working their way back to they've got all the way back in their tree to 7th great grandparents, Robbins. And I think somewhere in the 4th, 5th, 6th, I have a John Robbins and Elizabeth in my family tree. I have these two names. Now, I don't know yet if that's the same John and Elizabeth, because as you are well aware, there can be lots of John and Elizabeths in those British Isles type families, Irish, Scottish. There's a lot of common English that happens, so very common names. But that gives me hope that I might be able to figure out, I do have a John and Elizabeth Robbins in my tree that have a son, Jacob. And I am related through Jacob to Jacob's son, Isaac. So maybe Isaac and Thomas are brothers, and I can come to some conclusion from that. Now, that does not mean necessarily that's where our DNA link is, but that's a really good start. So you can see in here a lot of names that I recognize. But remember, other people's trees. We always have to be aware that not only our tree, but other people's trees can have errors. They may have the wrong people in the wrong place at the wrong time, at the wrong age. You just never know. So it's something to always keep in mind. So there is information on the PDF, and I'll show you that for my kit. It'll tell you the minimum match number of centimorgans, and all of the kits that I've run through here have a minimum between 30 and 40 centimorgans. So you're not going to see like 7 or 8. So that's just something to think about. They cut it off at a certain point, and so I have everyone between 30 and 40 centimorgans at the lowest. The maximum for all of my kits, they maxed out at 350 centimorgans. So they're not giving you the high matches. They're not showing you your parents and your children and other people who are really close to you, first cousins, for example. They're not giving you those matches. That's just clutter. That's not going to help you find a common ancestor. It does tell you the total number of DNA matches used. It'll tell you in the PDF the total number of clusters, the excluded matches, so that's the ones that have no shared matches, and it also tells you the excluded matches that have one shared match, and they call that a singleton cluster. So it wouldn't form a square, cluster square, it's just going to be a single dot. Before we talk about the other clustering tools, let me just mention, we talked about with my husband's all those extra gray that were everywhere. And I just want to mention, I didn't mention this in the time when I showed it, but my husband has a pretty high percentage of Eastern European Jew in his German line. And a lot of the Jewish lines have endogamy. And so I'm expecting that his will be tougher to figure out with all those gray in there. So just want to mention that before I move on. So there are other clustering tools, and these, if you want to write down or you want to get off the recording later, I'm going to demo these, but again, I'll do that after the recording because I can't redact any of the names. But Jonathan Brecker has a tool that's a shared clustering tool for ancestry matches. There are some great benefits because it's ancestry matches, and those of you who have ancestry accounts, you know that there's no way to do chromosome browsers and some of the other tools with ancestry matches unless you move to a third-party tool. So the nice thing about this, and the thing to just keep in mind, is that when you decide you're going to use this tool, you actually sign in to your ancestry account and allow this tool to access your match list. Then it compiles the chart. So it's something to keep in mind whether or not you're concerned about letting a third-party tool log in as you to pull those matches into the tool. So some people might not be comfortable with that, but it is out there if you want to use that for ancestry matches, and I'll show you what mine looks like in a minute. GEDmatch has clustering. Again, I've used GEDmatch's clustering tools before. They're amazing. Right now, I don't currently have any kits uploaded at GEDmatch. I might change my mind about that, but after they sold to Verigen, I removed my kits. But they do have some tools there if you happen to be on GEDmatch. And Genetic Affairs is another tool that has a free side and a pay side. I've not used it before. I have seen it. It works a lot like the other clustering tools. And there might be some advantages to that that I'm just not aware of. And we could talk about at the end if you want. So we're going to look at the clustering tools. I'm going to show you some of those. I'm also going to show you how I make my screenshots real quick, because I think that's something that as you're doing this, you're going to want to piece things together so that you can go back and reevaluate. And so making screenshots is important. The other thing that I always recommend, especially if you're adopted or you're helping someone who's adopted, is screenshot everything along the way, because sometimes when you mention adoption, people will make their information private or you won't have access to it anymore and you'll lose that. So I do screenshots all along the way for every DNA question that I'm working on. It just seems helpful to me to do that, but I'll show you how I do that really quickly and easily. And then next time we're going to talk about how to get organized, because that's a big challenge when it comes to all these files and screenshots and pictures and documents and family trees and test tools. So we'll talk about that next time. And then I'm just going to put up here on the screen, if you want to sign up for meeting announcements, you can send me an email at kelly.geneticsgenealogyandU@gmail.com, and I'll add you to the list, and then you'll have notifications about the meetings that happen live on Zoom or the recordings that I post after. So I'm going to stop the recording for now, and we'll do some questions and some demo. So give me just a second here to stop.